Amen. So you're there in 2 Chronicles, and as we're going through this series, just going book by book through the Bible on just an overview of the books. In Chronicles, if you remember, Chronicles, both first and second, is focusing on Judah, really. So if you think about it, First Chronicles is really dealing with David's kingdom, more so than Saul's kingdom. Even though David reigned over all of Israel, if you remember, he reigned over Judah, or that southern kingdom, if you will, for 7.5 years before he got over all of Israel. And what you'll notice in Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, is that you kind of just hear about the kings of Israel in passing. So they're just kind of mentioned because they're being brought up at the same time that the kings of Judah are going through their story. So really, 2 Chronicles is all about, well, Solomon in the beginning, and then it goes on to all the way to the end where they're going into captivity in Babylon. And it even mentions at the very end there on the fact that Cyrus, king of Persia, is going to give a decree or proclamation to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So we're talking all the way 70 years after the captivity is where this book ends. And really, when you get out of 2 Chronicles, you go right into Ezra, and it literally repeats that same thing. And so, the end of 2 Kings, the end of 2 Chronicles, and the beginning of Ezra are really just that one event where we're coming back into Jerusalem and rebuilding the temple. Now, there's 36 chapters in this book, and if you think about it, this book with 36 chapters is covering 1st and 2nd Kings. So, 1st and 2nd Kings. And if you think about it, the first 9 chapters is dealing with Solomon in this book. If you remember, what were the first 10 chapters in 1 Kings? Solomon, right? So really, you get the same kind of amount of chapters with Solomon. I believe the reason you have 9 in here is because Solomon's mentioned actually in 1 Chronicles at the end. So you're kind of already dealing with Solomon before you get into this book. But that means that you have, less than, just 20-some chapters to deal with the rest of all the kings after Solomon. So, and the reason I believe that's possible is because we're really just dealing with the kings of Judah. And so you don't have the story about Elijah and Elisha and a lot of these chapters that are dedicated to more around Ahab's time and all that stuff. So that's what you kind of see in First Kings and 2 Kings is more about the prophets and stuff like that are going on in Israel at that time. So in chapter 1 here, just going down the line, chapter 1, this is where Solomon is granted to be given wisdom. And so if you know that Solomon prays for wisdom, and in verse 11 here, so the first chapter there, verse 11, it says, "And God said to Solomon, because this was in thine heart, that thou hast not asked riches, wealth, or honor, nor the life of thine enemies, neither yet hast asked long life, but hast asked wisdom and knowledge for thyself, that thou mayest judge my people, over whom I have made thee king. Wisdom and knowledge is granted unto thee, and I will give thee riches and wealth and honor, such as none of the kings have had that have been before thee, neither shall there any after thee have the like." So it's basically saying, before him, after him, no one's going to be like Solomon. Obviously, we know that Jesus is greater than Solomon, so obviously, it's just like John the Baptist. There's not one born, none greater than John the Baptist is born among women. Well, obviously Jesus is accepted from that, right? But in this case, as far as all the kings of Israel and Judah and all that, Solomon, no one ever exceeded him in wisdom. So that's a big statement to make. And so we see that happening here in chapter 1. Chapter 2, Solomon's preparing to build the temple. So in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, "And Solomon determined to build an house for the name of the Lord, and an house for his kingdom." So if you remember, Solomon spent a certain amount of time building, I think it was like 6 or 7 years building the temple, but then it's like 14 years building his own house. Okay, so I think it's 20 years total, so I think it's 6 for the temple and 14 for his house, maybe 7 to 13, whatever. But I know it's 20 altogether. And so this gets into the fact of him preparing for that. Chapter 3, Solomon actually builds the temple. And so we see that in short there. And so some of these, if you obviously cross-reference this with 2 Kings, you may get some more information of what's going on there. And in chapter 4, it's really covering the furnishings of the temple. So this kind of gets into where there was like this big basin or this the sea, and it basically with these oxen that are underneath of it. And it gets into kind of details of different things that are in the temple and all the furnishings that would be incorporated with that. What you have to understand about the temple, okay, that Solomon made was that when you think about the tabernacle that's in the wilderness, the temple kind of basically built out from that. So there's a lot of this other stuff that's there as far as chambers for like the priests and all these different things. But then you had the actual tabernacle portion of it where you had the table of showbread, you had the candlestick, and you had the veil and all that stuff. But basically when Solomon built the temple, there's all this other stuff that's built around it. And there's like different stories to it and all this stuff, okay? So when you go to Ezekiel as well, which I believe is the blueprints for the second temple, meaning like after this first temple is destroyed, before they go or when they're going into Babylon, that second temple, the layout's there, and you'll see all these different, basically rooms and buildings and all these different things that are around it. Okay, so that's a fun study if you ever want to look into how that looked and try to visualize all of that as far as the lofts and the different things like that. So when you think about the temple, it's a lot bigger than the tabernacle that you would see in the wilderness. Okay. Chapter 5, the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple. So look at verse 2 there of chapter 5. So chapter 5 and verse 2, it says, Then Solomon assembled the elders of Israel and all the heads of the tribes, the chief of the fathers of the children of Israel, unto Jerusalem to bring up the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord out of the city of David, which is Zion. So, basically bringing in the Ark of the Covenant, putting it past the veil, all of that to get it in its place. And so the Ark of the Covenant is brought into the temple. So, chapter 3, chapter 2, preparing the temple. Chapter 3, building the temple. Chapter 4, putting all the stuff in the temple. Chapter 5, specifically putting stuff in the temple when it comes to the furnishings, is the Ark of the Covenant. Okay, so that is, and I believe the Ark of the Covenant, you think about all these furnishings and all these different things, the Ark of the Covenant is the actual Ark of the Covenant that they had in the wilderness that they're bringing in there that was built in Moses' day. Okay, so chapter 6, Solomon is praying to God concerning the house that he's built for God, the temple. Okay, so it's called the house, it's called the temple, it's called a palace, it's called different things. It's basically the building that's being built. And Solomon is praying that God would regard this place. Basically, that God would recognize this as his house that people can come and pray at. And in verse 24, just to give you a little snippet of what Solomon prays here, in verse 24 it says, And if thy people Israel be put to the worst before the enemy, because they have sinned against thee, and shall return and confess thy name, and pray and make supplication before thee in this house, then hear thou from the heavens, and forgive the sin of thy people Israel, and bring them again unto the land which thou gavest to them and to their fathers. And there's different scenarios that Solomon brings up with this, but basically he's stating that if this happens, then hear their voice. They come to this house and they pray to you, then hear their voice, regard it, and basically forgive their sin and all of that, okay? And this gets into another thing where it comes to that, Jesus even brings up, or it's brought up in the New Testament, that his house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, right? And that this isn't just regarded to with Israel, but obviously specifically to Israel because that's where it's at, that's where the covenant's being performed, all of that. But the idea of God regarding the house of the Lord and a place of prayer, and this obviously, I believe, translates into the New Testament in the fact that the church of God is the house of the living God, the pillar and ground of truth, and it is a place of prayer. So when we have, let's say, prayer meetings and different things like that, and obviously even in cases where maybe you come to be anointed with oil to pray for those that are sick and different things like that, that God regards that as such, right? And obviously in the New Testament it's great because we have local houses of God throughout the world and not just one place that you come to, okay, and one place in the whole world where everybody has to go to, okay. Chapter 7, God answers his prayer, and he answers, to begin with, by having fire come down from heaven. So it's kind of like very visual, that he's answering. Because in verse 1, it says, "Now when Solomon had made an end of praying, the fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the house." So it's very evident that God was answering yes to this. But then, obviously you had that visual aspect. And you think about it, when you think about fire coming down from heaven, you're like, why is it fire? Well, God is a consuming fire, so obviously there's that. But you have the idea that in the wilderness, if you remember, what would they follow and what would be there at the tabernacle was the pillar of fire or the cloud. Cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. And so what that represents is that, just as God was with that tabernacle in the wilderness wherever they went, God is here in this temple that Solomon built. God is regarding it, and it's not just being built to be built. And go to verse 14 there, verse 14. Because it's a very famous verse. But Solomon kind of gives all these different scenarios of if your people do this, but they turn to you, basically forgive their sin, right? It says in verse 14, it says, "If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and heal their land." Now this is obviously, when people try to apply this to eternal salvation, they're obviously taking it completely out of context, right? Because what we're talking about, the assumption here is my people, right? I mean, the idea here, obviously this is talking physically too. But if you're to spiritualize this, if you're going to spiritualize this, then you have to spiritualize my people. My people would then have to be believers at that point, okay? So when you're talking about this, yes, this does apply to us, spiritually speaking, but it's applying to believers. If those that are saved, which are called by my name, right? My people which are called by my name, if they humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then, and that's where it gets into, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us from all unrighteousness, that we may, that we may boldly come unto the throne of grace, and we may find mercy and attain mercy, to find grace find grace that help in time of need. And the fact that, that's what believers are to be doing. And obviously the house of God is there in the midst, okay? And this gets into church. Gets into the idea of, obviously attending church, being at church, and just the power of the congregation, if you will, okay, when it comes to being in good fellowship with God. Not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together as a manner of some is. And it says, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And obviously, sickness is a good reason to be out, okay? So when I say not forsaking the assemblies, obviously if you're not feeling well and you got a fever, you need to stay home. That I would actually prefer that, that you're not here getting everybody else sick. So, but if it's not for sickness and it's not for some legitimate case where you can't be at church, I mean, there needs to, the idea of being at church because of the fellowship aspect of just being in fellowship with other believers, but how that gets you in fellowship with the Lord, you're getting on the Lord's side there when you're at church around believers, singing the hymns, coming here and preaching, going out soul winning, doing all that, to where obviously we all mess up, we all make mistakes, but how much more is God going to be ready to just be like, all right, let's go, forgiven of things that we mess up with if we're basically coming to the house of the Lord on a weekly basis, and obviously him regarding that, okay? Chapter 8, Solomon is restoring and building basically cities that were in the realm, okay? So basically in the kingdom of Israel, he's basically kind of building up Israel in this chapter, okay? So he's got done with, it kind of starts off with the fact that he's done building the temple, he's been, done building his own house, and now he's kind of going off onto these other cities where certain cities were restored unto them, and now he's kind of building it up and all these different things. So basically, in Solomon's reign, he's basically building. It's a time of like kind of an industrial revolution, if you want to say that, meaning that it's just kind of like it's being built up and all of that, and you don't have a bunch of wars. Okay, so in David's time, just war, just wars and all of that. And that's why, obviously, he stated that he can't build God didn't want him to build the temple because, obviously the blood that was shed under his reign, okay? And then you have the fact that, well, Solomon is at peace until really the end of Solomon's reign, where he doesn't fully follow the Lord with all his heart. His wives turn his heart away from following the Lord fully and all of that. And obviously there's a downfall there where he's kind of getting into battles at the end of his reign. Okay, Chapter 9, we have the Queen of Sheba. And that story with the Queen of Sheba where, if you remember, she says the half had not been told. And dealing with the fact that she's coming from far away, she's heard of his wisdom, and she's not disappointed. Actually, it exceeds her expectations, essentially. It talks about Solomon's wealth. Obviously, you get into the fact that he made the shields of gold and all these different things, and basically talking about all that. I always think that I remember. I don't know when it lists off all the things that Solomon had. Who here remembers the apes and the peacocks? But like that's the thing that sticks out of my mind because apes are like I think that's the only place that apes are ever mentioned in the Bible. Not that they, like it has to be mentioned in the Bible for it to exist. It's like tigers don't exist because it's not mentioned in the Bible. It's like no. But the thing is that there's certain things that just kind of pop out in your mind that for whatever reason Solomon had apes and he had peacocks. So I'm guessing he had kind of like a zoo, or something like that. And Solomon, go down. If you're in chapter 9, there, look down at verse 30, and you just see the end of Solomon's reign here. And so 9 chapters in, we're dealing with all about Solomon, right? Very similar to 1 Kings. So if you think about 2 Chronicles, it's really just 1 and 2 Kings. Simply stated, right? Now, obviously, there's some information. There's a lot of information in the 1 and 2 Kings that's not in Chronicles, and there's information in Chronicles that's not in 1 and 2 Kings. But really, the time frame, if you think about from Solomon's reign till they're going into Babylon, that's the time frame. Okay, and so in verse 30 here, it says, "And Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. And Solomon slept with his fathers, and he was buried in the city of David, his father, and Rehoboam, his son, reigned in his stead." So 40 years, right? If you remember, how long did Saul reign? For 40 years. How long did David reign altogether? 40 years. And Solomon reigned for 40 years. Now, you could make the argument that maybe there was some concurrency involved in the reigning years. Obviously, I don't believe that that Saul and David were overlapping because he was dead. Okay, so, but there's definitely a case to be made about David and Solomon because Solomon obviously was made king while David was still alive. And then it even talks about how he was anointed again to be king after David died. So this happens all the time throughout the kings where you have co-regency, meaning that the father is still alive and still technically reigning while the son is also king and reigning. And so chapter 10, we get into Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and you really get into that kingdom split. So in chapter 10, you get the fact that Rehoboam has 2 different advisors when it comes to this. He has the older men and he has younger men. And the older men are like, hey, make the burdens of Israel lighter. And the younger men are like, no, make them harder. And he sides with the younger. And basically all of Israel's like, what do we have to do with the house of David? All of this stuff. And they basically split off. And Jeroboam's in the midst there kind of like being the provocateur. And the fact that he's basically pitting Israel against Rehoboam. Jeroboam takes the 10 tribes up north, and then you have, I believe Judah and Simeon are what's going down south, because Simeon's in Judah, right? It's literally inside of it. That would be awkward, right? Simeon's like, no, we're with the northern kingdom, and they have to constantly be passing through Judah to get there, right? Anyway, but that's why it's 10 tribes, that are going with Rehoboam and not 11. I believe that's the case, or that's why, okay? And Levi doesn't count because Levi literally doesn't have a lot of inheritance. And so Levi is everywhere, okay, as far as like their suburbs are in all the tribes. But what we'll actually see, though, is what's interesting in this book here is, like I said, it focuses on the southern kingdom of Judah. So once you get to chapter 11, it's really kind of focusing in on that southern kingdom, okay? When you're in the Kings, it's really kind of focusing on the northern kingdom because you're dealing with Ahab and Omri, Zimri, Ahab, and you're dealing with Elijah and Elisha, and they're all in that northern kingdom dealing with Ahab and Jezebel and all that stuff, right? This is more so, okay, what's going on down south, though, when that stuff's going on, okay? And when it comes to Rehoboam, it really gets into more details about his reign. And Rehoboam establishes that southern kingdom, and specifically, what happens is that not only do the Levites basically come from all the different tribes and come and dwell in Judah and in Jerusalem and all that stuff, because that's obviously where the house of God's at. That's all that stuff, right? But also other people from the tribes that don't want to be involved in this calf worship, okay? So if you remember when the split happens, what's the big sin of Jeroboam the son of Nebat? He makes 2 golden calves, puts one in Dan and one in Bethel, and basically says, these are thy gods, O Israel, that brought thee out of the land of Egypt. And you're just like, you talk about like history repeating itself, right? It's like, how on the nose is that when it comes to, like, it's not even that you made 2 molten something. You made 2 golden calves, and you even said the same exact thing that they said when they're in the wilderness. But basically, the reason that Jeroboam did that was because he was afraid of people doing exactly what happened after he did that. Okay, so if anything, what he does there actually causes that to happen, right? So, because notice what it says here in verse 13. So 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 13. And again, this kind of gives you, when you're in Chronicles, gives you a little more information about what's going on in that southern kingdom with Rehoboam and all that. In verse 13 it says, and the priests and the Levites that were in all Israel resorted to him out of all their coasts. For the Levites left their suburbs and their possession and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his sons had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord, and he ordained him priests for the high places and for the devils and for the calves which he had made. So basically, they're kind of being cast out. With anything, they're basically getting their jobs stripped from them, okay? Because the priests and the Levites have certain jobs within all those provinces. The Levites were to teach the law. There was a lot of things they were to do, okay? But it says in verse 16, and after them, out of all the tribes of Israel, such as set their hearts to seek the Lord God of Israel came to Jerusalem to sacrifice unto the Lord God of their fathers. So they strengthened the kingdom of Judah and made Rehoboam the son of Solomon strong 3 years. For 3 years they walked in the way of David and Solomon, which is interesting, right? The fact is that basically after that split, Rehoboam first basically is going to war. He's like, no, we're going to take it all. But then he basically draws back and just basically establishes his kingdom with what he's got left. And you have all the Levites coming to him. You have all these other people that are coming from all the different tribes. And this is why, when you're in the New Testament, you'll see Anna, the prophetess, think about how she is from Asher, right? Or Asher, when it comes to that tribe. And you say, well, I thought that tribe was long gone, because remember in 2 Kings in chapter 17, all of northern Israel is completely annihilated, and they're scattered about, and basically who's brought back in isn't even from Israel. And that's where you get the Samaritans and all that. Basically, there's other people that are brought in, and then they're made to kind of assimilate with the religion of Judah, but it's kind of this hybrid version of that, where they're kind of mixing in their false gods, but it's also kind of got the Lord in there as well. And so so you may think to yourself, well, why, like obviously Paul knew that he was of Benjamin, right? And you have cases like that. Well, Benjamin is right on the border of Judah. So you probably had a lot of Benjamites that were coming down into that southern kingdom. You had other people that are coming from other tribes that are coming down there, to where you kind of had this remnant of the tribes of Israel in Judah. Okay? But it was Judah. Okay? So that's why you'll have that divide of why they're called the Jews, is because they're of Judah. They basically became a part of that tribe, or became a part of that country that's down there. Okay? So anyway, chapter 12, Egypt actually spoils Jerusalem. Okay, so this is where, look at verse 1 here. It says, "And it came to pass, when Rehoboam had established the kingdom and had strengthened himself, he forsook the law of the Lord, and all Israel with him." So in chapter 11, if you remember, it was basically saying for 3 years they followed the Lord and they were doing what they should be doing, but then basically Rehoboam, stops following the Lord there and stops following the law. And what happens? The Lord's going to basically punish him for it. Because in verse 2 it says, "And it came to pass that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, because they had transgressed against the Lord." One thing I noticed there is the gap in time that for 3 years they were following the Lord, and it wasn't until the 5th year that God basically took it out on them. Basically, you can see that there was space to repent, right? There was space to get right. It wasn't just immediately they stopped following the Lord and it's like, all right, time to get punished. You had a space there. But this is where Shishak basically comes in and spoils Jerusalem and takes all the shields of gold and all these different things. And then Rehoboam basically has to supply him with shields of brass. So if you think about it, when you think about Solomon's reign, it's kind of like the golden age, right? For lack of better terms, there was a bunch of gold, right? But they had even gold shields. But then it goes right down to kind of the Bronze Age. And I know that's not how they use those terms, okay? I get it. The Bronze Age is like, we're talking about like cavemen type stuff, and then the Golden Age and all that. I don't really care. The idea here is that obviously it's regressed as time went on with Israel, that it went from, David's kind of peaking out, and then you have Solomon that goes even further than that. But then Solomon kind of starts dropping off a little bit before he dies. And then Rehoboam, now we got the kingdom split, and it's kind of going all right for a while. It's kind of like, yeah, it's not as good as it was with Solomon because you've lost a lot of the country, but you're following the Lord. The Lord can obviously bless there, but then he stops following the Lord and then it just goes downhill, okay? And what you'll see with the kings of Judah is kind of like this ebb and flow of like following the Lord, not following the Lord, following the Lord, not following the Lord. With Israel, it's more like Jeroboam, all right, we're just going to go to hell, right? Jehu, there's like this little blip of Jehu. It's like you're going down. It's like, oh, no, still going down, But with the kings of Judah, you do have this kind of ebb and flow of kings that are doing that, okay? And I personally think that in history in general, that's what we have. We have kind of a rise of righteousness and things of God, and then you have a decline, and then there's basically another incline where basically you come back up and then you come back down. And it's just a constant thing that you see throughout history in general. If you're to look at a bird's eye view of the whole world, I think that happens over time where you have, things going up and down, okay? So, where did I have you go? Let's go to chapter 13. You were in chapter 12, right? So Egypt spoils Jerusalem, and you have all that. Well, after Rehoboam is you have Abiah or Abijah, as it says in this chapter. So basically Rehoboam's son Abiah or Abijah starts to reign over Judah. And again, for sake of time, there's 36 chapters we've got to go through here. I'm not going to go through every single king and talk about everything they did, or even talk about one thing that every king did. There's just too much to go through in a short amount of time. So just know this, that obviously it's going in chronological order as far as the kings are concerned. You have Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah reigns over Judah. Chapter 14, Asa reigns in Judah. And Abijah's not good, but Asa is. So when you have Asa, it's kind of like, Rehoboam's kind of going down, Abijah's still going down, right? But Asa, you're like coming back up, okay? And it says in chapter 14, in verse 2, it says, "And Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, his God. For he took away the altars of the strange gods and the high places, and break down the images, and cut down the groves, and commanded Judah to seek the Lord God of their fathers, and to do the law and the commandment." And actually, in Kings, it says that he took away the Sodomites out of the land, right? So it's like, man, way up here, right? So he's doing really good. And then, basically, and a lot of these kings that do well, in their final years, they mess up for whatever reason. You just see this constantly happening. And like I said, when you find people in the Bible that finish off strong, you're just like, yes, finally, someone did it, right? And so finishing your course, right? It's that idea of like Paul and how he's talking about, I've kept the faith, I've finished my course. Listen, there's so many people in the Bible that did not do that. And people that were great, you look at and you're like, these are heroes of the faith, but they just mess up at the end of their life. And the thing is that he mistreats a prophet. So again, these chapters go through some details that you just don't see in the First and 2 Kings. And in verse 7, so just these are the final years of Asa. So he's doing well, but then in his final years of reigning, he does make this mistake. It says, "And at that time Hananiah the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said unto him, Because thou hast relied on the king of Syria and not relied on the Lord thy God, therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand." And basically, Hananiah the seer is basically just pointing out the fact that, hey, if you just would have relied on the Lord and not on them, then you'd be able to defeat them too. And he's just pointing out a fact that you need to really just put all your faith in the Lord in whatever battles you're fighting. In verse 10, it says, "Then Asa was wroth with the seer," obviously seer is just the prophet, right? "And put him in the prison house, for he was in a rage with him because of this thing, and Asa oppressed some of the people the same time." They're basically just angry that the prophet said anything against them and just not hearing rebuke or not hearing reproof. Chapter 12, "And Asa in the 39th year of his reign was diseased in his feet until his disease was exceeding great. Yet in his disease he sought not the Lord, but to the physician." So it's just kind of like this belligerent, like, what are you doing, Asa, at the end of your life? The prophet's coming to you, just giving you advice and basically saying, hey, this would have went better if you just would have relied on the Lord. He's not even coming to him and be like, hey, you're wicked and all this stuff's going to happen to you. He's just making a point that you would have been able to take out Syria too if you just would have relied on the Lord. And then he puts him in prison and starts afflicting other people. And then he gets the disease in his feet and he just will not inquire of the Lord. It's like he's got this vendetta against the prophets, I think, at that point. And to the point where he's just like, I'm not inquiring. I'm not going to go find a prophet and inquire because it's like he's so mad at them, he's just going to live the rest of his life with his disease in his feet. Okay, so that's where you kind of get the end of Asa's reign there. So it's kind of like he starts off really well, and you're just like, man, this is good. And then just, go through the kings and think about which king you want to be. And just make sure you read to the end, though. Okay? Because sometimes you read these kings, you're like, man, that's a good one. That's a good one. And then you read the end of their life, and you're just like, no, I'll pick a different one. So even some of the greatest ones, like Josiah and just different ones like that, and Hezekiah, like they just all kind of end on this sour note. And you're just like, what is going on? Chapter 17, Jehoshaphat reigns in Judah. And Jehoshaphat is the son of Asa. And he basically just picks up where his father Asa was on the right path. And verse 3, it says, "And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat because he walked in the first ways of his father David, and sought not unto Balaam, but sought to the Lord of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not after the doings of Israel." So he's doing kind of like Asa, where Asa is following the Lord, all of this. And, Jehoshaphat, specifically, it's kind of like he cleans up around the edges that Asa missed, right? So it talks about how, for example, Asa took out the Sodomites out of the land, but then it says Jehoshaphat took out the remnant of the Sodomites. So it's kind of like Asa basically took out the brunt of it, and he kind of got all the leftovers. And so he's kind of just cleaning house where his father left off. But again, Jehoshaphat was a good king, but he just kept getting mixed up with helping Israel. And in chapter 18, he goes into battle with King Ahab. And this is where you really kind of get to end the book of 1 Kings. So if you're talking about the timeline as far as where am I at in the Kings, you're really at the end of 1 Kings where Ahab's going to die and all of that. And in this story is where I believe we get the phrase jumping Jehoshaphat. Now, I can't really prove that, but you probably ever heard that phrase, jumping Jehoshaphat. Maybe not. Maybe you're too old. Maybe you're too young for that. Listen, I'm too young for that. Okay, I just heard older people say it back in the day. Okay, I'm just relaying the message. Okay, heard it on like Looney Tunes or something like that. Where they'd say this phrase, and that was made in the 40s. So who knows? But anyway, this is where the king of Israel, basically, Jehoshaphat disguises himself as the king of Israel. So it's kind of this weird, Ahab somehow convinces Jehoshaphat to basically disguise himself to be like the king of Israel. Anyway, they start running after Jehoshaphat. Well, then they realize it's not the king of Israel because it says in the middle of the verse there, it says, therefore they compassed, verse 31, it says, therefore they compassed about him to fight, but Jehoshaphat cried out, and the Lord helped him, and God moved them to depart from him. And I can't help but think of jumping Jehoshaphat when I see that. Now, that could be completely off base as far as where that phrase comes from, but who has the name Jehoshaphat? You know what? I think that's where it comes from, so therefore, I'm just going to stick with that. Unless someone convinces me otherwise. Wikipedia that later, see where that phrase comes from. But anyway, all I have to say is that basically Ahab gets killed, and Jehoshaphat in chapter 19 is rebuked by the prophet Hananiah. So, or I'm sorry, Jehu. So remember Hananiah is the one that got put in prison, right? Because he said something off to Asa. Well, Jehu, the son of Hananiah, the seer, is going to rebuke Jehoshaphat. And notice what it says here in verse 1. It says, and Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, returned to his house to peace to Jerusalem. And Jehu, the son of Hanani, the seer, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, shouldest thou help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore is wrath upon thee from before the Lord. So notice that God's not happy with them, that he is helping the ungodly, right? And those that help, loving them that hate the Lord, think about it, it's really Jezebel that's behind the ringleader of all this, right? And it even talks about how Ahab, how there was none like him, that basically talks, and it basically brings up Jezebel, that basically Jezebel is kind of moving him to do these wicked things. And so Jehoshaphat gets rebuked for that, and chapter 20, Jehoshaphat is fasting and praying to the Lord to be delivered from this great army that's coming against him. And it's kind of an army of Moab, Ammon, and just different, it's kind of like a combination of different countries. But basically, he calls the country to fast and pray, and the Lord ends up delivering them. Okay, so the thing that with Jehoshaphat is that, yeah, he messes up with Ahab, but, he does, he kind of has his ebbs and flows in his life as far as like following the Lord. He's kind of doing everything he should be doing, and then he just gets hung up helping the king of Israel. And really that's what it comes down to. If Jehoshaphat has a fault, it's that he's a Zionist. I don't know, I'm just kidding. He's not technically a Zionist because he's in Zion. Does that make sense, right? It's kind of this weird because Israel is the northern kingdom, right? But he just can't help but he just loves like those that hate the Lord. Like there's just something that it's his brethren, obviously. You can understand it. But he just keeps helping out the kings of Israel. So with Ahab, he gets rebuked for it. Then, he's getting right with the Lord, fasting, praying, all that stuff. The Lord delivers him out of this great host that's coming against him. And then he joins himself up with Ahaziah. So Ahaziah is reigning after Ahab, and Ahaziah is the one that falls through the lattice, all that stuff. But basically, he teams up with Ahaziah, who does a whole bunch of wicked things, and First Kings kind of gets into that, and going into Second Kings as far as Jehoshaphat kind of dealing with that. Okay, And so that's kind of Jehoshaphat's downfall, is that whole thing where he cannot just get over helping out Israel. Okay. And if you remember the prophet, it says, I wouldn't even speak to you unless Jehoshaphat was standing here, right? Because you have Micaiah. Remember that Ahab's like, there's another prophet, but I hate him. And basically the prophet's just like, unless Jehoshaphat was standing here, I wouldn't even speak to you. And I believe it's Elijah that actually says that, Elijah the prophet. But I might be mixed up on my prophets that's basically said that. But either way, Jehoshaphat is regarded by the prophets as being a good king. It's just that he keeps intermeddling with these wicked kings and that nation, okay? Trying to sing Kumbaya, with his brethren according to the flesh. Anyway, chapter 21, Jehoram, his son, reigns in Judah. Verse 1 there, just to kind of see that. In 2 Chronicles 21, verse 1, it says, Now Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, and Jehoram, his son, reigned in his stead. And Jehoram's not a good king. So you kind of have this downhill slope a little bit again, where Jehoram's not a good king. And then Ahaziah in chapter 22 is reigning in Judah, and he's not a good king. And I personally believe that in Chronicles, it gives a reason why it talks about Ahaziah reigning when he was 22 and 42, because I do believe that there was basically kind of like a captivity, if you will, with Ahaziah and all that, to where I believe he was a co-regent reigning with his father when he was 22, before his father died or around that time. But then there was this whole thing going on with this kind of captivity where Jerusalem's kind of ransacked and all this stuff. It talks about his sons all being killed, like all of Jehoram's sons being killed except for one that was saved, and they make him king. I believe that you kind of have that thing going on there with that. Okay, so there's kind of, and I believe Chronicles really answers what's going on there. Okay, but when Ahaziah dies, if you remember Jehu, the son of Nimshi, Jehu, who drives furiously, he ends up killing both Jehoram, king of Israel. So I know it's confusing. Jehoram, king of Judah, son is Ahaziah, but Jehoram, king of Israel, is a different person. And Jehoram, king of Israel, and Ahaziah kind of link up, and that's where Jehu's coming out towards them, and they're like, "Is it peace?" And basically they both die in battle that day. So at that point, you have these two kings that die. Israel is replaced by Jehu. So Jehu is made king over the northern kingdom of Israel. But what happens to Judah? Well, Athaliah, Ahaziah's mother, okay, who happens to be related to Jezebel, shocker, okay, but Athaliah basically kills all of Ahaziah's children, okay, and so, or all the seed royal is the way it says it, okay, so all the seed royal, they're all killed except for Joash. So Joash is saved by Jehoiada's wife and all of this. So in this chapter, in chapter 22, you see Ahaziah is reigning in Judah. Ahaziah dies. Athaliah reigns as queen, or basically kills all the seed royal, to where now she is basically next in line, right? Because she's the mother of the king, okay? And so she's now reigning, and Joash is saved from basically being killed. In chapter 23, Joash is made king, and Athaliah is killed. And in this is where it talks about basically take her from the rangers and have her killed, right? She's like, treason, right? So this is the story where Joash is there. They're proclaiming him king. Athaliah is all upset about it, and then she's killed. So Athaliah is killed, and Joash, is king, but he's very young, right? So he's like, I don't have it on my list here as far as how old he was. I think he was like 8 years old. But basically, he's very young when he's starting there. And Jehoiada, in this chapter, makes a covenant with the people. So basically, it's kind of like this refreshing and renewing. of the kingdom of Judah, because at that time it's kind of like you had this wickedness of Jehoram, then Ahaziah, and you had kind of like this whole thing where there's this kind of captivity thing going on there, and then Athaliah kills all the seed royal, and then she's basically reigning as queen for like 8 years. And then when this is kind of all dealt with, Jehoiada is basically kind of setting the people right, like, hey, let's go follow the Lord, right? And Jehoiada, it says in verse 16, chapter 23 and verse 16, and Jehoiada made a covenant between him and between all the people and between the king that they should be the Lord's people. So Jehoiada, they saved Joash, but they're also basically getting the people on board with following the Lord, getting back on track, okay? So really, if you think about it, it's really Jehoiada and his family that's really the ones that turn the country around at this point, and not the king, right? You kind of see the king comes in, he cleans house, he follows the Lord, but really in this case, it's really Jehoiada that's doing this, okay? That's really turning it around. In chapter 24, Joash is reigning, but Joash repairs the temple, and there's a whole story there as far as that's concerned. But this is where Joash just goes off the rails, okay? And this is just perplexing. You read the story and you're just like, what are you doing, right? Who saved Joash from being killed when he was a child? Jehoiada's wife, right? Jehoiada's wife and the house of Jehoiada. I mean, like basically they saved Joash, and then they made sure he was made king. And so in return, he ends up killing Jehoiada's son. Now, notice what it says here in 2 Chronicles chapter 24. And this is just like where you're thinking like, Joash, oh, this is a good one. This is what a great story, and how you're saved as a child, and then you're made king, and you're coming back to the Lord, and then this happens. You're just like, Like I said, nothing. When you're reading through the Kings and through Chronicles, if you're just wanting this nice, Disney story of like, good prevailing evil and just like happily ever after, like it's just not there most of the time. It's just reality, okay? This is reality. This is what really happened, and it is what it is, okay? And in verse 20 it says, and the Spirit of God came upon Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada the priest, which stood above the people and said unto them, thus saith God, why transgress ye the commandments of the Lord, that ye cannot prosper? Because ye have forsaken the Lord, he hath also forsaken you. And they conspired against him and stoned him with stones. Notice this, at the commandment of the king in the court of the house of the Lord. Thus Joash, the king, remembered not the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but slew his son, and when he died, he said, the Lord look upon it and require it. Now, I personally believe that this is the Zechariah, son of Berechias, whom ye slew between the temple and the altar, that's being referred to when Jesus is bringing up the blood of the prophets. Now, maybe it's a different Zechariah, but it literally says, where was he killed? In the court of the house of the Lord. Where's the court? You have the tabernacle, and the court is where the altar is. And so, when it says, and when he died, he said, the Lord look upon it and require it. Sound a little different than what Stephen said. Stephen says, lay not this sin to their charge. And I don't believe either one of those are wrong. I think that there's a case to be made to where, hey, this needs to be required, or hey, have mercy on them. And if you think about it, if Joash is a saved man, require it in this life on him, right? Does that make sense? Whereas if these people are just ignorant, think about Saul was standing there. Saul at the time was standing there with his clothes at his feet, consenting unto Stephen's death. And when Stephen's saying, lay not this sin to their charge, Saul is in that mix, right? And God didn't lay that sin to his charge and basically forgave him because he did it ignorantly in unbelief. And so that's another sermon for another day. I know I'm getting off track. I got to get through the chapters here. But anyway, again, there's a lot of information in 2 Chronicles that you just don't see in 1st and 2nd Kings. And that's why there's two different, that's why you have the Chronicles, and that's why you have the Kings. So you focus on one thing over here, you're focusing on something else. So Israel on the Kings, Judah on Chronicles, okay? Chapter 25, Amaziah reigns in Judah. And verse 2 there, just to kind of see a little bit about it. It says, so chapter 25, verse 2, it says, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, but not with a perfect heart. Okay, so he's kind of doing okay, you know. So if you think about it, like you're going downhill with Jehoram, Ahaziah, then you have Athaliah. Good night, that's really bad. And then Joash, you're kind of coming uphill a little bit, but then he like kills Zechariah, and you're just like, what in the world? And then Amaziah, he's doing okay, but he just wasn't perfect, meaning he had idolatry problems, okay? When you see that they didn't follow with a perfect heart, it's always dealing with idolatry. It's always with not having the Lord, you know, basically the first and second commandment, if you think about it, right? Thou shalt have no other gods before me, and basically just no idolatry. If you're going to follow the Lord perfectly with all your heart, then idols have to be out of the way. Okay, and that's kind of what's going on there. Chapter 26, Uzziah, or Isaiah, however you want to say it. He's also called Azariah, which I believe the reason why he's called Uzziah, specifically in the passage, is because Azariah, the priest, is being talked about. And there's like this conversation between him and Azariah. And that'd be really confusing if it was Azariah said this to Azariah, and then Azariah was angry with Azariah, and then it goes on and on and on. Okay, and here's the truth of the matter. Most all these people had multiple names or multiple versions of their name anyway, so it makes sense that Isaiah or Uzziah would be used here, okay? So Uzziah reigns in Judah. In verse 4 there it says, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord according to all that his father Amaziah did, okay? Verse 21, the thing is Uzziah was basically kind of a good king. You know, Amaziah was a good king, but he had problems with idolatry. Uzziah really messes up at the end, okay? Again, shocker, right? You do okay, and then you mess up at the end. Uzziah basically tries to do the priest's office with, like, offering incense and all this stuff. And basically, he's getting rebuked for it, and then he's just belligerent about it. And what ends up happening is God makes him a leper, okay? And a leper is where your skin is basically deteriorating off your body. And leprosy is basically kind of like a skin disease, and it's contagious. So when it says, contrary to what the Jews say, you know, they're like, oh, it's not contagious. Yeah, okay. Every time leprosy is ever mentioned, it's talking about basically going without the camp, getting away from people, and like all this stuff, okay? Verse 21 there says, and Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord, and Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. And this is another clear co-regency where Uzziah is reigning still. He's still alive, but he's a leper, and he's basically, when it says several houses, it's a great example of what several means, okay? When we say several, we're usually meaning like, you know, a quantity, right? You know, like how many donuts do you want? I want several, right? You know, several, a few, many, whatever, okay? Why I use donuts doesn't matter. But you kind of see the word sever in there. So when you talk about like every several gate, every separate gate, or every several ability, everyone has their own separate ability. And you can think about what is a several house? It's a house that's separate from the rest, right? It's basically kind of off on its own for a reason, because you're a leper, right? So that's kind of just, you know, terminology that's used in the Bible. And you can even see within the word severed. Basically, you're severing it from each other. Each gate in New Jerusalem is separate from the other gates. It's severed from the other gates and all that. Anyway, spending too much time on that word. Chapter 27. Chapter 27, Uzziah. We already see that Jotham is basically kind of reigning in his father's stead, but, you know, Uzziah dies, and it says in verse 2, it says, chapter 27, verse 2, it says, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Uzziah did. Howbeit, he entered not into the temple of the Lord, and the people did yet corruptly. Now, that's kind of interesting, you know, like how that's worded, right? So Jotham, he didn't make the mistake of his father, but it kind of alludes to like what Uzziah did in the past. Like, even though Jotham was doing right, it didn't undo what was done before. That makes sense? It's kind of like he did right, yet they still did corruptly. So sometimes it's not enough that you're just doing right. And what you see is that you'll see kings doing right, but then they take steps further than that to set the people right. And so that's where you get into, it's not enough just that you're doing right. You need to help others do right as well, and especially if you're in a position of leadership like that. Chapter 28, Ahaziah reigns in Judah, and Ahaziah is not good. Okay, so shocker, we're kind of going back downhill a little bit. But don't worry, Hezekiah's coming up. It says in verse 1 of chapter 28, Ahaz was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 16 years in Jerusalem. But he did not that which was right in the sight of the Lord, like David his father. For he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and made also molten images for Balaam. Okay, so basically, and Ahaz not only makes these molten images, but he puts them in the house of the Lord. Okay, so when Hezekiah comes on the scene in chapter 29, and there's a lot of chapters with Hezekiah, and you'll see these chapters not only in 2 Kings, the stuff about Hezekiah. So Hezekiah's got a lot of stuff in the Bible, meaning that you have it here. You have it here in 2 Chronicles, you have it in 2 Kings, but you also have these chapters that are in Isaiah. Because Isaiah is the prophet during Hezekiah's reign, and you'll see the same information about like Assyria and different things that are going on with Hezekiah in Isaiah. So you kind of have three different parallel passages to deal with Hezekiah. Okay, so in chapter 29, it says Hezekiah reigns in Judah, and he cleanses the temple. Okay. And it says in verse 1 of chapter 29, and Hezekiah began to reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned 29 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. And when it talks about him cleansing the temple, what you have to understand is that he had to get rid of all the idolatry that his father had in there. And what's amazing to me, though, is the kings that come from like a really wicked father. Does that make sense? Like, it's one thing to be kind of like a Jehoshaphat, and not to basically speak bad about Jehoshaphat, but Asa, his father, was generally a good king, right? He was kind of on the right track, and you kind of understand like Jehoshaphat just kind of picking up where his father left off. It's another thing when your father's like literally going like this, and then you take that and you go the other direction. And so I have a lot of respect for those kings that do that, like Asa, like Hezekiah, like Josiah, right? Where it's basically all going downhill, and then it just basically, no, I'm going to turn the tide. And that speaks volumes about the person. Not to diminish Jehoshaphat, because I think, like we talk about second-generation Christians, that sometimes it's easy for second-generation Christians, meaning like your parents are saved and they're on the right track, for you to take it for granted and then go downhill, right? So there's an argument for both cases as far as why one would excel and why one wouldn't. But I have a lot more sympathy for the person that comes from a really rough background and not doing what they should be doing than the person that has a good upbringing and then doesn't do what they're supposed to be doing. Does that make sense? Like, I have a lot more sympathy for the person that doesn't have a good background. Okay. Anyway, in chapter 30, he does this Passover, and there's basically a celebration. The temple's cleansed. There's a Passover done, and basically there hasn't been a Passover done like this in hundreds of years. That a Passover's been done like Hezekiah does it. And it just really shows you that for hundreds and hundreds of years, they just have not been keeping the law. And then when you get to Josiah, it's the same thing. It's just like, when people say that they kept the law or they kept the covenant back then, they're out to lunch. It just really shows you that God was very long-suffering with how they were keeping the covenant or how they were basically doing or not doing what they should be doing. Chapter 31, Hezekiah organizes the priests. And so he's basically, a lot of what he's doing is just kind of getting the house of God and getting all that together. And I preached on this when I was preaching about Hezekiah, but really what you have to understand is that there needs to be a revival from the church house. And what Hezekiah does first is he deals with the temple of God, deals with those that are in the house of God, the priests and all that, and that turns this revival where people are now wanting to come out of the country, out of all these, even out of northern Israel, and basically come down and all that. Now, obviously, in Hezekiah's day, northern Israel is going to be no more. Basically, I think it's 9 years into his reign is when that northern kingdom is completely annihilated. So some of those people get out in the nick of time. Does that make sense? Like, basically, there's this revival. People are coming down because Hezekiah is getting everything right, and then that whole northern kingdom is annihilated. Okay? So we have him basically organizing the priests, getting everything set in order there. And really, that's what a king needs to do. He kind of needs to be the one to call the shots and be like, hey, here's what needs to happen. Here's what you need to do. You guys need to get this stuff right. It should be the priests and the Levites that have this all figured out. But you know what? If they don't have it figured out, Hezekiah's coming in and basically getting it done. Okay? Chapter 32 is where Assyria comes in to besiege Jerusalem. And God delivers him from them. And what you have is Sennacherib is the king of Assyria. And he's sending his messenger Rabshakeh. And this is the story you'll see in 2 Kings. This is the story you'll see in this chapter. But this is also the story that you'll see in Isaiah, where basically Rabshakeh's coming and basically trying to threaten all the people that are there. That, who's delivered, all these other nations out of the king of Assyria's hand and getting them to try to frighten them. And in the end, God delivers Jerusalem and Judah out of their hand. And even secular history will show that Assyria was completely annihilating everybody around, and they could not take Jerusalem. So obviously the Bible's right, when it comes to secular history anyway. But even secular history agrees with the fact that Jerusalem was not, for whatever reason, they can't explain it. Like, you listen to people that they're definitely not claiming to be Christian or anything like that, and they're just basically, for whatever reason, the king of Assyria could not take Jerusalem. They could not take Judah. Now, we know the answer because God's the one that caused them not to be able to take it. Okay? And you have that story there. Chapter 33, Manasseh reigns. Okay, so Manasseh is very wicked. But what's interesting about this chapter, chapter 33, if you just read 2 Kings, you'd be like, Manasseh's a reprobate. Like, almost guaranteed, you read through that and you believe the reprobate doctrine, you're like, this guy's done. This guy is just gone, right? But then you read 2 Chronicles 33. 2 Chronicles 33 in verse 1, it says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. So he reigns a long time. Okay? And it says, but did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord, like unto the abominations of the heathen, whom the Lord had cast out before the children of Israel. So he kind of goes way back. So Hezekiah is like good king, right? Now Hezekiah messes up at the very end of his reign. But also, he gets 15 years out of Hezekiah's life. And when you look at how old is Manasseh? 12 years old. That means that those 15 years were not added to Hezekiah's life under his request. Manasseh wouldn't even have been born. Okay? But that being said is that Manasseh is basically going way downhill. But in this chapter, we see that Manasseh actually gets right with God. And this is a great example, just like Solomon and just like other people in the Bible, where we can really see how far someone can go. Kind of like Paul, right? Paul gives an example that he was chief among sinners. We see how far someone can go before they're kind of given over to a reprobate mind. And Paul was to the point where he's basically consenting and hailing people into jail and consenting unto their death, breathing out threatening toward Christians and toward the church of God. That's how far it can go, right? Well, in verse 10 here it says, and the Lord spake to Manasseh and to his people, but they would not hearken. Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns and bound him with fetters and carried him to Babylon. So Manasseh's literally carried to Babylon. And it says, and when he was in affliction, he besought the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the Lord, or before the God of his fathers, and prayed unto him, and he was entreated of him, and heard his supplication, and brought him again to Jerusalem to his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that the Lord, he was God. And it even talks about how Manasseh is basically trying to clean things up at the end of his reign. So, very interesting, right? Whereas when you're reading through 2 Kings, you're like, dude, this guy's done, right? You're just like, man, that guy had a horrible reign. Now, that's not to diminish, because Manasseh actually sacrificed his son to a false god, right? It's not to diminish that he did some horrible things, okay? But in our lifetime, we have people that are literally committing abortions and all these different things. And listen, there are people that commit abortions and they can still get saved. And so, that being said, interesting story there. At the end of that chapter, Amon reigns after Manasseh, and he reigns for 2 years in Jerusalem. And Amon is not good. Okay, so it's kind of like Manasseh reigned for a long time being wicked, and he finally humbled himself and got things right, but his son ended up turning out bad. So, but he doesn't reign for that long. And then Josiah is one of those that comes from kind of a bad background. His grandfather did get things right, but his father was bad. And in chapter 34, Josiah reigns in Judah, and this is where they find the book of the law. Hilkiah finds the book of the law, and obviously Josiah is very tender-hearted about it, and wanting to get things right with the Lord, and all that story with Josiah basically getting the country back on following the Lord. Chapter 35 is Josiah again, and Josiah is keeping the Passover, which you kind of see that kind of rhyme there, where they get back to the things of the Lord, and it's like the Passover is like what they're trying to keep. And they're trying to keep that feast of that Passover and get that right. At the end of chapter 35, Josiah is killed in battle, and this, again, it's kind of like Josiah does so great, and then for whatever reason, he's trying to get involved in some war with the king of Egypt, and even the king of Egypt's just like, what are you doing, man? He doesn't say it like that. This isn't the Message version, but what are you doing, bro? Why are you coming up to me, bro? Don't come at me, bro. The thing is that he even says, Pharaoh Necho says, the Lord has told me to go up onto this battle, right? So Pharaoh Necho is basically he's fighting a battle that has nothing to do with Josiah or the kingdom of Judah. And then Josiah's just like, no, I'm going to go fight this. And then he ends up dying. And which just really shows you that, listen, if you're going to go outside the will of God and you're just going to do whatever you want to do, there's not going to be that protection on your life if you're just going against that, especially if you're going against what God wants someone else to do, okay? And also shows you that just because you've done great things in your past doesn't mean you have immunity to just basically do whatever you want and do things against what God wants, okay? So chapter 36, we read that for our chapter, and that's the last chapter. And really what you see is the fall of Jerusalem to Babylon. And really what you see with this, okay, Josiah dies, and Jehoahaz is basically set the reign, but then Pharaoh Necho sets up Jehoiakim, and Jehoiakim reigns for 11 years. And Babylon takes Jerusalem right after Jehoiakim's reign, but it doesn't completely destroy Jerusalem, okay? So that makes sense. Like, they're taken captive, and Jehoiakim's son, is taken captive, and he's in Babylon. He ends up getting out of prison, and he ends up living a great life after that. But basically, there's kind of like this reign of Jehoiakim for 11 years. Jerusalem is basically besieged. Everybody's taken captive. And then Zedekiah is set up to be king, and he reigns for 11 years. But when he messes up and doesn't submit under the king of Babylon, then the city is completely annihilated. Does that make sense? So Jehoiakim, captivity, things are obviously disheveled, right? But it's really Zedekiah where they mess up. So when you're reading through Jeremiah, for example, you'll see Jehoiakim and you'll see Zedekiah. Jehoiakim's first, Zedekiah's next. And what you see is that basically the stuff about Babylon coming with Jehoiakim is that they're going to come and take people away, and obviously they're going to be under captivity and all that. But when he's talking to Zedekiah, he's like, you're going to be completely annihilated. The wall's going to be broken down, the temple's going to be destroyed, everything's going to be annihilated, and that's what's going on with Zedekiah. Okay? And at the end of the chapter, we see where it's also talking about the fact that Cyrus, king of Persia, is going to be the one that's going to make the decree, a proclamation to rebuild the temple. Okay, and that's where you get into Ezra, which, spoiler alert, that's the next book. So let's end with a word prayer there. Heavenly Father, we thank you for today. Thank you for your word, and thank you for these books and these passages. Lord, help us to know all all the information we can about the kings, and that we can learn about them and apply either what they do right or to our lives, or to learn from their mistakes and apply that to our lives. Lord, we love you. We also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.